Well, let us begin with this week's topic. We're going to talk about the Apostle Paul. If you've looked into any sort of critical scholarship of Christianity, and by that I mean if you look into anything that's kind of critiquing Christianity, anything that's looking against Christianity, you're going to know how much Paul is either despised or ignored or kind of made fun of. He's a bit of a controversial figure. And that's because if you're, as a critical scholar, you're trying to look at how did what Jesus started, this tiny, movement among Jewish peasants, how was it taken and maybe co-opted, would be their words, by Saul of Tarsus? How did he take this thing, kind of reform it, reshape it, and make it into a world religion? That's kind of their thesis that they're going to live by. Because to them, what Paul is propagating and what Jesus are propagating are two very different things. We as Christians, we would believe that is not the case. We would say that Paul is firmly planting himself in the scriptures of the Old Testament, speaking forth the message that has always been proclaimed by the Old Testament. But because of the cross, because of the gospel that is, brought forth in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we're able to fully understand better what those scriptures were saying. So today we're going to try to, in a way, a bit dissect the life of Paul so that people can understand him better. There are two resources that I would highly, highly encourage. Both of them are by a guy named N.T. Wright. There's a book called The New Testament in Its World. The New Testament in Its World. It is kind of a textbook style book by N.T. Wright, and it's basically trying to give you the context of the Bible within the Greco-Roman world, Jewish Greco-Roman world. Highly encourage that. And then there's a biography by N.T. Wright of Paul that tries to really give a lot of color. And he's not trying to fictionalize Paul's life, but there's times where he kind of takes safe liberties. He's trying to understand how would a guy that has come from this background get to where he is. Really great book. So both of those are important. N.T. Wright, probably one of the most premier Pauline theologians of our modern era. So I encourage you to check out those if you have any more information that you want to learn. Feel free to ask me questions about those resources later. All right, well, let's kind of get an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Paul's background. We're going to talk about his timeline. Where does he fit compared to Christ and the other activities of his world? We're going to talk about his travels. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with his theology. So background, timeline, travels, theology. If I was a better speaker, I would have given you a T that represents background, but I just couldn't, so I can't get the perfect alliteration. Please forgive me. So we're gonna jump firstly into a quote by John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom is a famous church father. He preached in Constantinople, very, very influential on the reformers. So the reformers loved John Chrysostom. He was a very expositional preacher, so people look back to him with great fondness. So he says this: I grieve and I am pained that all people do not know this man, Paul, as much as they ought to know him, but some are so far ignorant of him as not to even know for certainty the number of his epistles. And this comes not of incapacity, but of their not wishing to be continually conversing with this blessed man. For it is not through any natural readiness or sharpness of wit, my misspelling there, readiness or sharpness of wit, that even I am acquainted with as much as I do know, if I do know anything, but owing to a continually cleaving to the man and an earnest affection towards him. So John is trying to paint this picture that he is constantly having conversation with Paul. He's constantly interacting with Paul through his letters, and that there's people that don't even know how many letters he's written, don't know much about this person. And, we as modern Christians in our Christian world, we can kind of relate to this, right? We are either firmly planted in this reality, or we know people who are, meaning we kind of go, I know a little bit about the Bible, but I'm not continually reading as much as I probably should. Or we would say overall the Christian church is fairly biblically illiterate. So John's encouragement to all of us is that be a person who is familiar with Paul. There is a benefit that's going to come to your life by understanding his letters, understanding his theology, and you can live a life that is more glorifying to Christ ultimately. So how can we better understand Saul? Well, Saul was born in a town of Tarsus. Tarsus is, as you can see here, down this way is to Israel, so Israel's down this way. This is southwest Turkey. So modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor, as the Romans would have understood it as. So it's kind of in this inlet, this little bay right here, and it is a strategic point for trade and for travel within the Roman Empire, simply because as you're going up into, if you want to head north into what is kind of Galatia, you have to go through the Tarsus Mountains. And if you could see, it might be hard in this picture right here. It's what's called I think it's called the Gates of Tarsus. It's basically a giant valley that you could go through. So if you wanted to go north into Galatia, if you were trading, if you were coming and you had your ships coming into Tarsus and you wanted to get up into the center of Asia, you would go through Tarsus and then up towards, up on some sort of Roman road. So it is the capital of the region called Cilicia. So Cilicia is this general region right here. It's a very important strategic area. It's a port city which is filled with pirates. So if you remember, I was speaking about the first triumvirate. You had Pompey, you had Caesar, you had Crassus. Pompey was famous for and renowned in the Roman Empire for kind of suppressing the piracy that was in the Mediterranean Sea. So there was a cohort of pirates that were in Tarsus that would go out, they shiver your timbers, they would take your treasures, and they would take it back to Tarsus. That was crushed down by the Roman Empire, by Pompey specifically. And then those businessmen, pirates, they understand how to make good money, then sort of shifted their focus and they made the city of Tarsus a really economic booming center. So it's growing and growing, and as it's growing, it's drawing in more people, it's drawing more influences. It's a large center for, it's a Jewish epicenter, so a lot of Jews in the time of the Seleucid Empire, when we were talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, when he's persecuting the Jews during the time of Hanukkah, we've kind of covered that, the Maccabees. A lot of Jews are kind of getting out from underneath the heat, and they're moving to places like Tarsus. As you can see, it's an imperial favorite, so the Julius Caesar was so impressed with this city that he gave them an imperial tax break, meaning they didn't have to pay the imperial tax. So if you're a libertarian, you're absolutely loving that guy. And so they are so fond of Julius Caesar that they rename it Juliopolis. Now, obviously, it's not really called that anymore, but it's a center that people are impressed with. The Roman Empire are impressed with. And finally, it becomes a center for academic rigor. It becomes a Boston-esque style school, Oxford-style school, where places like MIT and Boston and Harvard are obviously centered in Boston, and Oxford obviously in Oxford. But it's a center where philosophers start flooding into the city. So someone like Athenodorus, Zeno, Antipater, Nestor, these are famous Stoic philosophers, are kind of in the world. These are all men that would have been in the time of Saul of Tarsus. So you can see that this is a very colorful city. This is a booming place to be. This is a metropolitan. You would have learned a lot. You would have seen a lot as you're in Tarsus. So what does that have to speak of when it comes to our friend Saul? So this would have mean he would have been around a lot of different influences. He would have had a large contingent of Jewish people that he would have been surrounded by, but then a large contingent of the philosophers and academics of his era. And that's going to play a big role in his life later. There's a large contingent of the mystery cults, which we'll try to talk about the mystery cults when it comes to the church, the early church, in a couple weeks. But if you know of Mithras, Mithras is a Persian god who they kind of meet in little tiny secret conclaves, and they drink blood and they eat bread, and there's a whole controversy about that. So, but Mithras, so there's all sorts of religion. Religion is, everywhere in the world of Tarsus. Well, let's talk about kind of specifically his family. This is a nice painting of a Jewish family, watering their sheep. At least that's what I Googled for. So we can understand that his family are devout Jews. We hear in bits and pieces that he grew up and he eventually came into the group of the Pharisees, right? And so if you are growing up and you're moving into the Pharisees, that means you were raised up into the heritage of being a good Jew, of being a Hebrew. So his family must have been either, the theory is that they were either taken captives from Judea, from Israel, and taken to Tarsus, or maybe they were soldiers that eventually were found refuge there, or they just ran away from home. We're not quite sure how his family got to Tarsus, but they seem to be devout Jews. We know that he is a tent maker, and we assume that a lot of times professions were passed along to your children. So if you were a tent maker, most likely your children would be tent makers. We could see this in the life of Christ, right? That Joseph is a carpenter, and so the assumption is that Christ would then be a carpenter with him. So tent makers, if you're familiar, don't look like what you find at REI. A tent maker in that time is essentially a leather worker. You're a tanner. You're taking goat hides and you're turning them into stretched canvas, facilities. So this is, if you know anything about tent, do you know what ancient people used to tan hides? They would use brain. They would use, you would take bits of brain, you do that. You would use urine, and sometimes you'd even use fecal matter. If you've ever heard the phrase piss poor, that literally comes, excuse me for being crass, but that literally comes from the phrase of you would sell your urine to the tanner in order to get some money, and he would use that to tan money. So if to be piss poor means that you were so poor that you had to, and if you were so poor you didn't have a pot to piss in, that literally meant you didn't have a receptacle to take to the tanner, right? And so if you're a tanner, it's smelly and it's stinky and it's kind of gross, right? So very interesting, right? Just a bit of a background for etymology of some idioms. But interesting stuff, right? You were a tent maker, and it wasn't a prestigious job. Let's just say that. Yes, ma'am.
Is it known what house their family heritage is?
So Paul says in Philippians chapter 4 that he is of the tribe of Benjamin. So it's assumed, we're kind of taking him on his own word there. And it would make sense. His name was Saul. Saul is the first king of Israel, and he was of the tribe of Benjamin, right? So the king wasn't firstly in Judah. It was in the tribe of Benjamin, and then it switched over to that. We'll actually talk about Philippians chapter 3 here in a second. But great question. Yeah.
If their tanning had to do with urine and fecal matter, wouldn't they continually be unclean?
I was thinking that same thing. So the question was, if as Jews you're touching dead bodies, you're touching bodily fluids, things like that, you would technically be seen as ritually unclean. I'm guessing that would have been the case. I thought about that this morning. It's so funny you should say that. I thought about how does that work as a good Jew, being a tent maker? Now you know that somebody had to be making tents within the tribe of Israel. And so somebody had to have kind of taken on the responsibility of being ritually unclean more often than not. And just for clarity's sake, being ritually unclean doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a sinful person. It just limits your ability to go in front of God's presence in the tabernacle or in the temple. And there's a process to become ritually clean again. But great question. I thought about that, and I'm going to try to do some research this week. Very astute. We know that Paul's family were Roman citizens. This was not something that every person in the empire was privileged with. Some people had, if you were in Rome, you were obviously a Roman citizen, but then throughout the rest of the empire, you could either purchase your citizenship, eventually there was a process by which if you were in the army, you could earn your citizenship. So the theories are that his families were slaves, that eventually they were given their freedom, and then thus maybe they purchased or they were just given some Roman citizenship. But this gives you certain rights, certain freedoms as an individual, right? And we'll talk about that here in a minute, but it would limit your ability for certain capital punishments. It would require that you have certain rights of trial. You weren't just kind of whisked away and dealt with by whoever because they had an ought against you. So very important that he's a Roman citizen. We'll kind of dig into that. And then finally, there's an assumption that his family was well-to-do. They must have had some means of money. Once again, is it from their tent making? Is it from their, they're just some sort of inheritance? Was it somebody gave them money? It's not quite clear, but they're living in Tarsus. I'll kind of go back for a second for people who might have just come in. They're living in Tarsus over here in southeast Turkey. Israel's down here. Jerusalem's right here-ish, right? At some point, he is sent down to go and study in Jerusalem. We'll talk about who he studies under, but he'll study in Jerusalem and he'll eventually become a Pharisee. In order to be able to be sent that far and to live that way, you got to have some sort of money to be able to do such things. And Paul seems to be very astute to the philosophical arguments of his age, the Stoics, the Platonists. As he's writing his letters, he's dropping some information. He knows certain things. So you don't just get that by accident. I'm assuming that there was some sort of education that he must have received within Tarsus that allowed him to know these things. And if you're doing that, if you're getting that good of an education, there's going to be some money that comes with that. Well, let's look at what Paul has to say about himself. What is his background in his own mind? Philippians 3:5-6 says that I was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law blameless. So we could see that circumcised on the 8th day, right? That is the prescribed law according to Moses. So if your parents are doing that, they themselves must be devout Jews. So kind of going back to pointing to his family. He was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. This is an honorable idea, the fact that you know what tribe you came from. So, rewind. In the days of the Assyrians come, they deport the top 10, or the northern 10 tribes, not the top 10 tribes, this isn't a list, but the northern 10 tribes, and they take them away into exile. The southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remain in the land. They get deported. They eventually come back after the Persians say that they can come back. So to be a Jew and to know, in fact, what tribe you were from is a very key idea. The Samaritans they're gonna say that we're Jews as well, but they're not always sure where they fit into the picture, right? So it's very important that he knows that he's tribe of Benjamin. A Hebrew of Hebrews, that is less a religious title. That is more of a, your genealogy. He's trying to say, I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, is that my mom is a Jew, my grandma's a Jew, my great-grandma's a Jew, so on and so forth. Your lineage as a Jew goes through your mother, right? If your mom is a Jew, you are equated to Jew, because we don't always know who dads are. You know what I'm saying? We know who the mom always will be, but you're not always sure who the dad is in a child, right? So that's kind of the thinking in there. So as to the law of Pharisee, we've spoken about the Pharisees, right? These are very strict adherents to God's covenant. They believe that through their ever more strict adherence, that they're going to produce the coming of the kingdom, right? That through their adherence, that God will bring His Messiah, that God will bring about the kingdom. So he's saying something about his type of religious faith. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. We're going to talk about this word zeal here in a little bit. But he's saying that I was so adamant about my Jewish faith that I persecuted the church and I was as to righteousness under the law. In the Roman Empire, there was something called the Tria Nomina, right? The Tria Nomina basically means it's your name, right? Every person had 3 names. It's a very familiar idea for us, right? We have 3 names as well. We have our surname, our middle name, our first name, our middle name, and our surname. So we have a very similar thing going on. Now, when you're reading the gospel, or when you're reading the book of Acts, it starts off with a man named Saul of Tarsus. Saul is met with Christ. He eventually goes on some mission trips, and in the middle of his first mission trip, his name switches to Paul. And for the rest of that time, his name is Paul. Now, when I was first coming to Christ, I always heard this idea that like God gave him the name, that God, changed his name. That is not the case, right? Has anybody been told that idea that God gave him that name? It's kind of like from Jacob to Israel. That is, from what it sounds like, what it seems like, that is his birth name. His birth name is Saul Paulus. We don't know his last name, but each person in that time was given multiple names. Now, if you're looking at the Gospels and you're looking at a guy named Matthew, certain Gospel writers will call him Matthew. Other Gospel writers will call him Levi. Very good, right? So there's a common thing to have 2 names that you could be used interchangeably. Yes, right? So Bartholomew, Nathaniel. And I remember reading, when I was a Christian, I was reading the Gospels. I always was like, oh my gosh, there's 2 different people. The Bible writers, is this reliable? And then once again, the whole point of us having this class is that the more we understand, the better we can understand our Bible. So his name is in fact Saul Paulus. Paul is a more kind of a Greco-acceptable name. And so when he's going, he starts to preach in the synagogues. Once the Jews reject him, he then goes into the greater Gentile world. And so it seems to be, once that transition happens of him going exclusively to the Jews, to the greater Gentile world, that he then takes on his middle name of Paul. All right. A physical description. What did Paul look like? Really, there's nothing from the New Testament that we can give, but there's a book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla. It's an apocryphal book. We don't count it as inspired, but I think it's a very famous quote of what Paul looked like. You might have heard it before. It says that Paul was a man of small stature, with a bald head and crooked legs, and a good state of body, with eyebrows meeting and a nose somewhat hooked, full of friendliness. For now he appeared like a man, and now he had the face of an angel. I don't know about you, but I'd be so offended if you made this description of me. Just disregard it. Just don't describe me, is what I'm going to say, right? If you think I look like this, and I just might well, who knows, right? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But the bald head, crooked legs, and eyebrows meeting, I don't, and a nose somewhat hooked. You're like, all right, you could just say, hey, he was a nice guy. That's all you needed to say about me. Crooked legs, I don't know if that means bow-legged, but so you can see that this was written around the 200s, so this is something that we don't necessarily rely on for truth. But if you look at a lot of the early church fathers, they seem to kind of be endorsing this description. So who knows, right? But the beauty of it is that, God, man looks on the outside, God looks on the inside. So, if so, God love him. Well, let's talk about the timeline of Paul. Where does Paul fit in the whole scope of what we've spoken of thus far? It is estimated that Paul was born anywhere between 5 and 10 AD. That is basically trying to work his life backwards, assuming how old he was when he was doing his ministry of persecution, and then how old everybody else is. So, Paul is born around, let's say, 5 AD. N.T. Wright, book that I shared with you all earlier, he's going to nail it down to 6 AD. But this is all speculation. He then studies under the Jewish leader Gamaliel between 15 to 20 AD. So this would have been a very normal thing, that a young Jewish boy goes and studies under a rabbi. It's further kind of confirmation that he must have had some sort of financial means, is that how in the world would this, if he was just a peasant, scraggly boy, how does he catch the eye of one of the most key Jewish leaders of his time? Gamaliel is just that. He's one of the most important Jewish leaders. When we talked about the Midrash and we talked about the other Jewish writings that are being produced after the fall of the temple, it speaks very highly of Gamaliel, kind of gives some of his quotes, things that he did. He is also in the book of Acts. I shared chapter 5. I spoke about this, that Peter and Paul are arrested. They're, what are we going to do with these guys? And Gamaliel kind of stands up and he says, hey, listen, we know of other false messiahs that have come, right? If they are like one of these people, if this is a movement of man, then just leave it alone and it'll fall away. If this is indeed a movement of God, we don't want to be people who are standing against God. So Gamaliel kind of stands up and gives a bit of wisdom on how to handle this kind of Christian thing that's going on. Of course, they didn't call it the Christian thing until later on. But so he studies under Gamaliel. So Gamaliel is a very conservative, he's a Pharisee, so he's teaching Saul to be a very strict adherent to the Mosaic Code. There were, as we've already spoken of, more conservative and more liberal streams. Gamaliel falls under that more conservative stream. We have Christ's crucifixion around 30. It's either 30 or 33 AD. We're talking about why it's one of those two dates. So Christ is crucified at that time. Paul then seems to be converted 3-ish years afterwards. Some people put it up to 18 months afterwards, but we have the famous story. Paul shares 3 times his story of meeting Christ on the road to Damascus, of being blinded. Each time, there's a lot of controversy under the fact that each time it's a little bit different. He'll say one thing one time, another thing another time. If you're a critical scholar, you look at that and go, must be a lie. There's no way that that's true. But if something happened to you, i.e. you got in a car wreck, depending on who you're talking to, you're going to give different details of how that car wreck happened, right? If you're talking to a police officer, you're going to try to be as detailed as possible. You're going to try to be as much, as legalese as possible. If you're telling your buddy later on for a good laugh to tell a fun story, you're going to embellish. You're going to, obviously, we don't believe that Paul is embellishing and lying, but in my case, it's telling the story. I'm telling it in a different lens. I have a different goal in me trying to tell it. So that's my point is, we shouldn't be shaked by different tellings of his story. So Paul is converted. He meets Christ around 33 AD. He goes up to Damascus. He spends a little bit of time there in ministry. He then goes down to Arabia. What's in Arabia? Does anybody know? You're kind of shaking your head. You know what's in Arabia? Where? Huh? You said harems. So in Arabia, that's it's south of Israel. The assumption is that he goes to Mount Horeb, that he goes to the very mountain, Mount Sinai, that Moses goes to, that Elijah goes to. So we have the story of Elijah. He's being persecuted. He doesn't know what to do because of Ahab and Jezebel. And so he goes down to Mount Horeb, and that's where he hears God's voice in a still small voice. And it's this moment of kind of reshaping and reforming of Elijah's prophetic ministry, reboldened as it were. And so for some reason, Paul does a similar thing. And so the assumption is that he goes down maybe on a kind of a soul searching, maybe on just kind of a time of insight and prayer and fasting. If you speak to a scholar like Zach Ruder believes that he meets Jesus Christ there and is literally taught the gospel by Jesus Christ. He shared that one time in WIT, and I thought that was the most fascinating thing in the world. And I need to go and ask him, like, where did you learn that? There are several different theories about what's going on in Arabia. He then goes back up to Damascus, and he is doing ministry there. What I don't have on this timeline, there's somewhere between him going back to Damascus that a man named Barnabas goes to Damascus. Excuse me, that's not true at all. First trip to Jerusalem. Excuse me, I am right. I'm going on the right pace. So Damascus. Paul then takes his first trip to Jerusalem. I thought I was in a different place, but I'm not. Paul takes his first trip to Jerusalem, and if you're reading in the book of Acts, it'll say that the kind of the Christians in the area are like, what are we supposed to do with this? This was a guy who was persecuting us. Now he's saying he's with us. So it's a very standoffish kind of introduction to Paul. But he meets Peter, he meets Paul, or he meets James, and is sort of kind of given the hand of fellowship. He then goes back to Tarsus for 10 years. So he goes back home. Now imagine this. Imagine. Many of you will have a similar story. You grew up in a certain type of family background, and then you became a Christian. And then when you went back home, your family looked at you like you had a third eye. And we have to imagine that this would have been some sort of the experience that Paul had as he goes back to Tarsus. Your family were devout Jews. They are, covenant followers. They are very conservative in their leaning of their Judaism. And you go back and you're saying, Jesus is the Messiah, and he resurrected from the dead, and he is the Lord. And all of history has changed because of him. You got to imagine that his family was looking at him going, you're out of your mind, Paul. This is not, or Saul, we raised you better than this. Right? N.T. Wright in his biography makes a big point of this. Like, there would have been a lot of friction as he goes back to Tarsus. And then it speaks about in Romans, he says he's speaking about how there are certain people of the Jewish faith, of his family, that aren't accepting it. He would give up his salvation, or he wished he could be accursed so that they could understand the means of salvation. Someone like N.T. Wright is going to go, he's speaking about his mom and dad. He's speaking about some of his brothers and sisters, right? So we got to imagine that this, Paul is facing a very interesting situation. This season right here is kind of just glossed over, especially this part right here, him in Tarsus. In the book of Acts is very glossed over. We don't really see much about what's going on in the life of Paul. Then, as I spoke about earlier, a man called Barnabas comes knocking on the door. He goes up to Tarsus. He says, I need your help. You need to come down to Antioch, and we're going to be ministers of the gospel there. So he goes to Antioch, which is a Syrian Antioch. There's another Antioch in Galatia, not confusing at all. But he goes to Syrian Antioch, and he ministers with Paul there. This is where you have Agabus. He gives the prophecy of there's going to be a famine in Jerusalem. And so very, very key time in Paul's life. Well, the Holy Spirit pushes Barnabas and Paul forward, and they go on their first missionary trip. We'll kind of look at a map here in a second. They go around and they go to Cyprus. They preach the gospel. They go back up to Galatia. They jump up into middle Galatia area. They come back down and they go back to Antioch. It is at this time that someone like N.T. Wright, and I keep pointing to him because I read a lot of his stuff this week, it's at this time that it is guessed that someone like Peter comes to Antioch. This is the story in Galatians chapter 1, where Peter comes up, he's having a good time, he's hanging out with the Gentiles, he's eating good food. James, some of the people from James comes up. Peter goes, whoa, 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 I can't be eating with Gentiles. At which time Paul steps up and says, hey, listen, if we're going to be united under Christ, then we got to be united under Christ. You're saying you're not even living like a Jew anymore. So that's not what he says. But he kind of says, if you are not acting, in the ways of the law all the time, then you can't expect these people to. So ultimately, there's this funny period of which it's assumed that Peter comes up to Antioch. Now that's asterisk. Some people believe that's a later point. Paul then writes the books of Galatians, right? And that's when he speaks about this time, because in his first journey, he's going around, he's preaching the gospel, and he's getting the Gentiles are receiving the gospel, receiving the good news. So the people are following up on that, saying, hey, in order to be a good Christian, you got to get circumcised because you got to be a good Jew. And Paul's saying, no, that's not the case. We're all one under Christ. We then have the Jerusalem Council that kind of answers that issue. What are the expectations for the Gentiles again? All right, well, don't eat blood, don't eat strangled things, keep away from sexual impurity, but you don't have to get circumcised. All right, we're done with that. Or at least that's what we wish. He goes on a second missionary journey. He goes on up to, he hits Greece and Macedonia, so this is where he's in Corinth. He's in Thessalonica. This is when he writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonica. Now this is a debate. The idea is that Galatians is the first letter that he writes, or 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are the first letters that Paul writes. And look at how early these are. 50-ish year 50 AD, which is around 20 years after Jesus is crucified. And in that time, what we're seeing is the robustness and the richness of the Christian theology is already growing, right? Now, critical scholars are going to want to say that the books of the New Testament are written so much later than Jesus' birth that or Jesus' death, they can't be relied upon. Especially if they're going to point to the Gospels. But there are already ideas that are being cemented about Christianity this far after. If you look into kind of how we, the Old Testament, ancient scripts, ancient manuscripts, and you look at the life of Alexander the Great, the earliest manuscripts of the lives of Alexander the Great are 200 to 300 years after he was alive. The life, other than someone like Julius Caesar who wrote his own autobiography, the lives of a lot of ancient people are decades, if not hundreds of years after the events happen. So when it comes to biblical story, the biblical timeline, our letters are so much more closer to the events that occurred than any other ancient, examples. So we want to see that it's really important to know that these letters are early as they are and as reliable as they are. Paul's in Corinth in 51 to 52 AD. He goes back to Antioch, so that ends his third journey. He says hello to the Ephesians, but then he dips out real quick. He doesn't stay there too long. He leaves on his third missionary journey, and this time he spends 3 years with the Ephesians. So he's really, pouring into the life of the Ephesians. He writes 1 Corinthians. There's a belief that 1 Corinthians is actually the second letter in a series of 4 is the kind of the estimation. Paul writes Philippians in 55. Paul writes Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians in 55 and 56. Paul writes 2 Corinthians in 56. A lot of people believe that's like the third or fourth letter in the series of letters to the Corinthians. A lot of drama with the Corinthians. Paul writes the book of Romans. He's never been there yet, but he's sending on saying, hey, I'm about to come and see you soon. And then Paul makes his final trip to Jerusalem. And if you go back and read the story, I encourage you. What chapters are those? Final trip to Jerusalem starts in Acts 21. If you're reading the Acts 21 on forward, there's a handful of times, like 2-3 times, where friends of Paul are saying, "Do not go to Jerusalem. Something bad is going to happen when you go down there." But he's like, "No, I have to go to Jerusalem. I have to go to Jerusalem." And at one point, prophet stands up, takes a belt, ties his arms, ties his hands, ties his feet, and says, "If you go to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen to you." Paul says, "No, I gotta go." And it's very similar. It's a parallel with Christ and Paul, that Christ is setting his eyes towards Jerusalem, as the book of Luke says. And Paul seems to be doing the same thing, that I am going to do this thing no matter what. And so you have this idea, Paul even speaks about it, right? That I'm filling up in my body what was lacking, the sufferings of Jesus Christ. And you go, what in the world does that even mean? Paul, give me some more information, man. But he seems to say, like, for Luke, who writes the book of Luke and who writes the book of Acts, it seems like he's paralleling these two individuals as their ministry goes along. And he goes to Jerusalem. He's beaten up by a bunch of his Jewish compadres. The Romans say, "Hey, stop that." They put him in prison for about 2 years. It's a great book. You should go and read it. He preaches to Felix. He preaches to Agrippa. Really good stuff. He travels to Rome. He's shipwrecked. He goes to Malta, all that jazz. And then he's imprisoned in Rome around 60 A.D. It seems as if he's not in there for very long. The book of Acts ends, Acts chapter 28 ends right here, that he's receiving people into prison, he's preaching the kingdom of God. Beautiful. And then it's done, right? What in the world is going on here? Well, it's believed from people like Eusebius and other early church fathers that he left and he goes to Spain. He is pushing towards Spain in his ministry, and it seems as if he actually did that. He somehow goes back to Rome, or gets back to Rome. Maybe he's arrested in Spain. We're not sure. He's imprisoned in Rome again around 62 A.D. It's assumed this is when he writes 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, especially 2nd Timothy. 2nd Timothy is a very heavy, sad book. He's saying he's been abandoned by people. He knows he's ready to be poured out like a drink offering. The dude is ready to go. He knows that doom is coming. And then the death of Paul. It's assumed that he is beheaded under Nero, Caesar Nero. Nero is a crazy dude. The myth is that he burnt down half of Rome in order to build his palace. He blamed it on the Christians, and then he persecutes a bunch of Christians, and Paul and Peter feel the brunt of that. All right, so let's jump real quickly. I have 10 minutes left. I don't have enough time. Let's just move on through through the service, okay? We're all going to miss the worship service today. We're going to talk about Paul. But Paul, first missionary journey, he leaves Antioch with Barney. He goes down to Cyprus. People call him Barney? I don't know. So Barnabas and him go down. They're preaching the gospel. And it seems like in every time they preach the gospel, the Jews are not having it, the Gentiles are, and then they kick him off to the next space. So eventually he heads up into southern Asia Minor area. He jumps up. This is Galatia. This is southern Galatia. He hits Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. Then he kind of makes his way back to Antioch, and then they loop down and they head back home. So this is a really quick ministry. This is where I believe it's in Derbe. This is where he gets stoned. It's either Derbe or Lystra. He gets stoned. They think he's dead, and they pull him back, into the city, and he's alive. And so when we're talking about his physical appearance, it would make sense that he had a hook nose and he was bald-headed, and this guy was beat up nonstop, right? You read 2 Corinthians, the last chapter there, he's talking about how many beatings he's got, how many times he's been shipwrecked. I mean, this guy's life is hard. And so if he's got a funny-looking face, you just got to give him some grace, okay? Get off his back. Okay, so anyway, he goes back, and he gets back home, and he goes to Antioch. Second missionary journey. See, he's in Caesarea. He goes up to Antioch, and then he kind of visits his old churches again, right? Oh, this is great. Let's go visit our friends here who we planted churches. Scripture says that he wanted to go up north to Bithynia, but the Holy Spirit prevented him. And then it said he wanted to go south, but the Holy Spirit prevented him. So then he goes, excuse me, that was so rude. And then he goes this way, and he goes to Troas, and this is Acts chapter 10. This is where we assume that Luke joins the group, because then it switches from they and he to we, right? So this is the we passages start here. So Luke seems to be jump over here. He goes over, this is where he has a dream. There's a Macedonian man saying, come over, preach the gospel to us. He goes over to Philippi eventually. This is where he meets Lydia, the purple dealer. She was a rich lady. And so he preaches the gospel. He then goes down to Berea. The Thessalonians, they kick him out. They don't like him. He goes to Berea. They do like him, right? The Bereans are commendable people. He eventually goes down to Athens. This is where he preaches in front of everybody on Mars Hill. He preaches to the philosophers. The philosophers think that he's lost his mind because he's talking about a dead guy raising from the dead. He goes to Corinth. He says hello to the Ephesians for a couple weeks, and then he heads back down because he wants to go to Jerusalem. Third missionary trip. Makes his trip, sees his friends, his old churches, spends 3 years in Ephesus, and then he kind of does this circle again. He has to go. This is when he deals with the Corinthians. If you're reading I believe it's the 2 Corinthians, it talks about there's a meeting of tears. There's this idea that he must have had a meeting with the Corinthians that went really, really bad. Something difficult went going on here. So he goes and has his meeting of tears. He kind of goes back down, and this is when he heads to Jerusalem, and when he's imprisoned there. Finally, he makes his trip to Rome, leaves there. He's in Caesarea forever. Goes to Sidon. They go here. This is when there's a crazy storm. They don't know what they're going to do. They think they're going to die. That's over here. They think they're going to die, and then land on Malta. He's bitten by a snake, and he doesn't die. So the people go, wow, that's pretty cool. He must be a holy man, right? So goes up to Rome. There's that. 5 more minutes. Paul's theology. There's a whole lot of things that you could put on here. But justification through faith, that's over and again, even in the book of Acts, that is speaking about how faith comes through, or salvation comes through faith. And that's why the Gentiles can partake in this thing, is because all they have to do is have faith. All they have to do is believe. Let alone if you read the book of Galatians, let alone if you read the book of Romans, obviously. Glory through suffering. In the book of Acts, Paul talks, he's like undaunted by being stoned, being whipped, being hurt in any sort of way. And then in Romans, he speaks about the same thing, that these light afflictions aren't worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed. And then a big thing for Paul, especially if you read the book of Galatians, but even in Ephesians and Philippians, you're going to talk about it's the current age and the age to come. So if you've ever heard the theory of, or the idea of the already and not yet, so right now we live in the current age by Paul's vernacular. But then, and this age is marked by satanic rule. Ephesians chapter 2, right? That it's the prince of the power of the air that's working inside of us. That there's these principles, Philippians, that are deceiving and working against us, and they're kind of dominating this time. But something happened at the cross to where we as Christians, we are living already in the coming age. That this already exists. That on this plane of living, this plane of reality, right? This dimensional world where Christ is ruling inside of your heart today, Christ is already here. That he already is king, that he is in charge, and he's defeated these things. But then there's a lot of people that stay on, and by dimension I don't mean anything too weird and spooky, but they live in a world that is still dominated by principalities and dark forces, right? Christ rules through his church in this coming age, and there will be an eschaton, a time where Christ acts for the final time, and this coming age living will be the only age of living, right? That'll be his rule will be the forever rule, and he'll finally subjugate even the last enemy, which is death. And so Paul is constantly talking about how there's these wars that are waging between the current age and the coming age, and that we have to, as active participants, we got to hold or take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And so he's very much already believing that Christ has already acted. It's already happened, but then there's another happening, right? This is a very, once again, I kind of point week in, week out. This is a very reformed ideal of how the world exists. If you're a dispensationalist, you're going to say there's no way that Christ is already here and ruling and reigning, because you don't like to believe that. So, anyway, Paul's theology, 3 minutes. I'm going to give you a 3-minute diatribe on how do we read Paul within the context. So, how much should we look at the context of Paul's world and glean what's going on there in order to better inform what we're doing, right? How we're reading Scripture and how it's being influenced in our lives. So if you look at the book of Galatians, it's going to have this big argument whether you should get circumcised or not. And if you're looking at the context of where the Galatians are, in that region, the Jews of that area had a sanction not to worship the imperial cult or go to kind of the imperial parades on a regular basis. So they were allowed to not do that. And if you weren't a Jew, you had to participate in those things, right? But because the Jews worship one God, they were asked, hey, don't pray to the emperor, pray for the emperor. That was kind of their way out so that they didn't have to worship a false god. So the assumption is that as new Gentile believers are coming into this faith thing that there's only one true God, that we don't worship the emperor as a god, they begin to say, well, we're not going to the parade either. We're not going to sacrifice to these imperial cults either. Well, then their neighbors are looking and going, hold on. You're not a Jew. You're not allowed to do that. So there's an assumption that the pressure for the Galatians is that the Jews were looking and going, listen, you're going to ruin what we got going on here. Get circumcised now, act like you're a Jew, and then don't have to go to the thing. And so there's this external pressure on these Gentile believers to say, hey, get with the program. You're going to get us persecuted here. Don't do this. And so Paul has to come along and go, hey, no. You're saying that there's a political issue here. I'm saying that there are political and theological issues here. If you submit again to the circumcision, you're submitting again to the law. And if you submit to the law, you're going to submit to death, right? Because you have no way of obeying the law unto salvation. But Christ did that for you so you could give up circumcision, right? So that colors our pictures of the Galatians. It actually makes us understand, oh, okay, like there's a lot of pressure that's going on with this scenario. It's not purely a theological issue. Very seldom in our lives do we deal with purely theological issues. Even within the Reformation, right? We're thinking, oh, this is a whole theological argument. No, Rome is a political agent in the Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire is a political agent, and it wants to say that it has some theological powers, right? So, Galatians. Now, so I would encourage you, there's some instances where we should kind of glean in and go, all right, this helps us color. There are some times where I think we ought to be careful and to be considerate on how we understand that. What do I mean by that? Let's talk about Ephesus and 1 Timothy real quick. So in Ephesus, the key cult, the key worship was Artemis. Artemis was the goddess of the hunt. She was the goddess of birth. And she had this huge, amazing temple in the city of Ephesus. So people are worshiping her. In the book of Acts, we know that there's a riot caused because less people are worshiping and buying little idols, that the silversmiths are like, we're not having this. Let's kill some Christians, right? So Ephesus is this key center. The people who were in charge of the cultists of Artemis were women. They were the ones that were given the authority spiritually. They were the ones that were looked to and kind of seen as the arbiter between the spiritual, which they wouldn't have thought about it necessarily like that, but between the divine and the human, right? So They are the arbiters of that. These women were bold, strong women because Artemis was. Artemis, and she had sculptures of her where she's covered with these little nodules, these little bulbous things all over her body. And for a long time, they're like, what are these? And there's an estimation, and I'll try to be careful, that these are from men that she did not like. And she took something from them and placed them on her body. If you have questions about what that means, we'll talk about it later. But she is a very domineering, strong, powerful woman, is the kind of idea of Artemis. She was the god of childbirth. She didn't like you. She would send a spear through your womb so that your baby died. Kind of a spiritual spear is what we're trying to, the idea. So she was seen as this very powerful, vindictive individual in Ephesus. You get to 1 Timothy, and Paul says that, listen, I don't permit a woman to be in charge, or I don't permit a woman to be in charge of a man, or to be head over a man. So if you are of a certain theological bent, you're seeing that statement of I don't let that happen and elders should be men through the lens of, well, guys, in Ephesus, women are domineering, women are strong. These priestesses of Ephesus are receiving Christ, they're coming into the church, and they're trying to take over. They're trying to dominate. So, icto facto, women can be elders, women can be pastors, because Paul isn't speaking to the reality of us, he's speaking to the reality of the Ephesians. Don't you understand that? And if you understood that, you would say women can be elders, right? That's the argument for some individuals who say that women can be in eldership. Now, what I think that ignores is a lot of other pieces of scriptural evidence, right? They're believing that the evidence, or their argument is going to be that Jesus comes and introduces a new ethos of life, of men and women are equal, and which we believe that they are. But what that ignores is that if Christ was such a revolutionary, and he wasn't afraid of reprisals from people, if he really wanted to make a statement, he could have made half of his apostles females and half of the apostles males. Paul speaks also to men in leadership by the sake of creation. That, Adam was created first, then Eve. So my point is, we could over-contextualize and try to estimate the value of that history, but we have to understand that we have to look at the whole reality of Scripture. We can't only look at, well, in ancient, Greek times, this is how it was, so this is what he's speaking to. I think there are realities to that, but also I think there are realities of God divinely speaking and giving us ordinances that speak beyond even their context. Does that make sense? So hopefully I'm trying to help you understand how we should look at some of these things and how we should weigh them out. That's all that I have. I know I'm 5 minutes over. Forgive me again. But thank you all. Be blessed.